She was 19 and homeless. No family left who could take her, no savings, just a canvas rucksack and $1 she had earned gathering ginseng on the ridge above Hot Springs. And with that $1, she bought a forgotten midwife's cottage on a hollow road in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, in a stretch of Madison County that had not seen a working herb room since the cottage had closed in 1968. The stone walls were buried in ivy. The chimney stack was standing, but what nobody knew was that hidden beneath the birthing stone in that old cottage was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Essie Greer had grown up with the smell of drying plants, not the polite smell of a garden center herb section. The deeper, wilder, more complicated smell of roots dug from mountain soil and bark, stripped from creekside trees and flowers gathered from meadows at specific times of day, because certain plants release their oils in the morning, and certain plants release them in the afternoon, and the timing of the gathering determined the strength of the preparation. Her grandmother had taught her to follow these smells the way other grandmothers had taught their grandchildren to follow a trail or a song or the sound of running water, as a path through the world that led, if you stayed on it, to something that healed. Her grandmother's name was Dovy Greer, and she had been an herb woman and root doctor in Madison County, North Carolina for 34 years. Dovy had not been a physician. Dovy had not been a nurse. Dovy had been the thing the mountains had before there were physicians and nurses, the woman in the hollow who knew the plants and who used them to ease what could be eased and soothe what could be soothed, and who understood, in the specific humble way that mountain herb women understood, the difference between curing and caring. Dovy did not claim to cure, Dovy claimed to care, and the caring had taken the form of 34 years of preparing plant remedies from the roots and bark and leaves and flowers that grew within walking distance of her kitchen door. Dovy had been born in 1934 in a log cabin in a hollow called Greer Branch, outside the town of Marshall, Madison County, North Carolina. She was the daughter of a man named Elijah Greer, who had farmed a steep rocky cove on the French Broad River, and who had, like most mountain people of his generation, relied on plant medicine for the ailments that a 40-mile drive to the nearest doctor's office made impractical to treat otherwise. Elijah had known the basic remedies: boneset tea for fever, slippery elm bark for cough, witch hazel for swelling. But the real knowledge in the hollow had belonged to a woman named Ada Worley, who had been the midwife and herb woman of Greer Branch from 1921 until her death in 1968. 47 years of walking the hollow roads with a basket of preparations, attending births, treating fevers, setting poultices, and preparing the specific plant medicines that the families of Madison County had relied on before the paved roads came and the clinics opened and the old knowledge began to fade. Ada Worley had lived in a stone cottage at the head of Greer Branch, a small square building with a stone chimney, a slate roof, and a large flat hearthstone inside the front door that the women of the hollow called the birthing stone, because it was the stone the laboring women had knelt on or squatted beside when Ada attended their births, and the stone was worn smooth in two places where generations of hands had gripped it. Ada had built the cottage in 1921 with stone she had quarried from the creek bed, and she had lived in it and worked from it for 47 years, and the cottage had been, for the families of Greer Branch, the closest thing to a hospital the hollow had. Dovy had apprenticed to Ada from the age of 12. She had walked up the hollow road to Ada's cottage every Saturday morning from 1946 until Ada's death in 1968. 22 years of Saturday mornings, each one a lesson in plant identification, preparation, and application. Ada had taught Dovy to identify the medicinal plants of the Blue Ridge by sight, by smell, by taste, and by touch, the four senses a root doctor used because the fifth sense, hearing, was reserved for listening to the patient. Ada had been specific about the listening. A person who comes to you with a cough does not need you to cure the cough, Ada told Dovy once when Dovy was 14. A person who comes to you with a cough needs you to listen to the cough. The cough will tell you what it needs. A dry cough needs moisture, slippery elm, mullein. A wet cough needs drying, horehound, bee balm. A deep cough needs loosening, wild cherry bark, colt's foot. You don't decide what the cough needs. The cough decides. You listen. Dovy had listened for 34 years. After Ada's death in 1968, Dovy had continued the work from her own kitchen in the cabin on Greer Branch, a small room with a wood stove and a heavy oak table that served as both dinner table and preparation bench, with bundles of drying herbs hanging from the ceiling beams and rows of mason jars on the shelves filled with tinctures and dried preparations. Dovy had walked the hollows the way Ada had walked them, with a basket on foot, visiting the families who needed her, bringing the preparations that the mountain plants provided. She had continued until 2002, when her knees had made the walking impossible. Dovy had known 41 plants by the time she finished her apprenticeship with Ada, and she had added 11 more across her own 34 years of practice, for a total of 52 species she could identify, gather, prepare, and apply. Each plant had required her to learn not just the name and the remedy, but the full life of the plant, where it grew on the mountain, what soil it preferred, when it bloomed, when it set seed, when the active compounds were at their peak, and how to dry or tincture the plant to preserve those compounds. Golden seal, for instance, grew only in the deep shade of north-facing coves, and it had to be dug in October after the berries had dropped, because the root was richest in berberine, the compound that gave golden seal its antimicrobial properties, in the weeks after the plant had finished putting its energy into fruit and had redirected it back into the root. A golden seal root dug in July was half as strong as a root dug in October. Ada had known this. Dovy had learned it. Essie would learn it from both of them. Dovy had also been careful about what she did not know. She had told Essie, more than once, that the most important thing an herb woman could say was, "I don't know." She told Essie about the time a man from Walnut had come to her with a pain in his chest and had asked for a remedy. And Dovy had listened to him describe the pain and had said, "Mr. Caldwell, I don't know what that is, and I'm not going to guess. You need to go to the hospital in Marshall." Mr. Caldwell had gone. He had been having a heart attack. The doctor in Marshall had said that if Caldwell had waited another 2 hours, he would have died. Dovy had told Essie this story not as a failure, but as a success. The success of knowing the boundary of her knowledge and not crossing it. An herb woman who treats a heart attack with boneset tea is an herb woman who kills a man, Dovy said. The plants can do a lot. The plants cannot do everything. Knowing the difference is the whole trade. Dovy had told Essie stories from the hollows the way certain grandmothers tell trade stories, as instruction, as case law, as a way of teaching a child that the work was not about the plants, but about the people. She told Essie about Mrs. Shelton on Laurel Branch, who'd come to Dovy every autumn for 20 years with the same complaint, a tightness in her chest that came with the cold weather. And Dovy had made her the same preparation every year, a tea of mullein leaf and wild ginger, and Mrs. Shelton had drunk it every night from October through March for 20 years, and had said every spring, "Dovy, the tea kept me alive another winter." Dovy had not argued with the word alive. If Mrs. Shelton believed the tea kept her alive, then the tea was doing its work, and the work included the believing. She told Essie about old Mr. Ramsey on Shelton Laurel, who had cut his hand on a tobacco knife and whose hand had gone septic, and Dovy had packed the wound with a poultice of plantain leaf and golden seal root, and had changed the poultice every 12 hours for 6 days, and the infection had cleared. The doctor in Marshall, when Mr. Ramsey finally went, had looked at the hand and said, "Who treated this?" Mr. Ramsey said, "Dovy Greer." The doctor had looked at the healed wound and said nothing, because the wound was healed and there was nothing to say. Dovy had married a man named Farley Greer, a cousin, a logger who had cut timber on the ridges above the French Broad for 20 years, and who had come home every evening with sawdust in his hair and pitch on his hands, and who had understood that a wife who kept bundles of drying herbs on the ceiling and mason jars of tinctures on every shelf was a wife whose kitchen was both a home and a pharmacy, and that the correct response was to eat his supper at the end of the table that wasn't being used for preparation. Farley had died in 1998. Dovy had continued alone. Dovy and Farley had had one daughter, a woman named Jolene, who was Essie's mother. Jolene had left Madison County at 18, had moved to Asheville, had worked as a motel housekeeper, had had Essie with a man who had stayed for a year and then had not stayed, and had died of a stroke at 31, when Essie was 3. Essie had been sent to live with her great-aunt, Dovy's sister, a woman named Bertie, who had a small house in Marshall, and who had worked at the post office for 28 years and who had taken Essie in because Bertie was a Greer, and the Greers did not send children to strangers. Essie had spent every weekend and every summer at Dovy's cabin on Greer Branch from the age of 5. The cabin had been the fixed point. The kitchen that smelled of drying herbs and wood smoke. The oak table with the mortar and pestle and the brass scales. The ceiling beams hung with bundles of boneset and mullein and bee balm and wild ginger, each bundle tied with cotton string, each one labeled in Dovy's handwriting on a small paper tag. Dovy had taught Essie to identify plants by smell at 5. She had taken Essie into the woods behind the cabin on a June morning and had knelt beside a patch of wild bergamot and had crushed a leaf between her fingers and held it under Essie's nose. "What does that smell like?" Dovy said. Essie said, "Like the tea you make." Dovy said, "That's because the tea is this plant. The plant and the tea are the same thing. The only difference is the water. Remember this smell. If you can find this smell in the woods, you can find the tea." By 7, Essie could identify 20 plants by smell alone: bergamot, boneset, mullein, horehound, slippery elm bark, wild cherry bark, golden seal, ginseng, sassafras, witch hazel, and 10 more. By 9, Dovy had taught her to gather, to cut the plant at the right point, at the right time of day, and to dry it in the right way. Leaves were gathered in the morning before the dew burned off and dried in the shade. Roots were dug in the autumn after the plant had gone dormant and dried in the sun. Bark was stripped in the spring when the sap was rising and dried in a warm room. Each plant had its own calendar and its own method, and the method was not optional. A leaf dried in the sun lost its oils and a root dried in the shade rotted. By 12, Essie could prepare a simple remedy: measuring dried herbs on Dovy's brass scales, grinding them in the stone mortar, steeping them in hot water, or packing them into a poultice cloth. By 15, Dovy had let her prepare a remedy for a neighbor, a tea of horehound and wild cherry bark for old Mrs. Ponder's winter cough, and Mrs. Ponder had drunk the tea and come back the following week and said, "That's the same tea Dovy makes." Essie said, "Dovy taught me the recipe." Mrs. Ponder said, "It's not the recipe, child, it's the hands. The recipe is just words. The hands are what makes it medicine." Dovy had also taken Essie to Ada Worley's cottage every summer once on a walk up the hollow road to the head of Greer Branch. The cottage had been empty since Ada's death in 1968. The stone walls were buried in ivy. The slate roof was intact. The door was locked. But the birthing stone was visible through the window. The large flat hearthstone inside the door, worn smooth in 2 places by hands. Ada Worley delivered every baby in this hollow for 47 years, Dovy told Essie. She knelt on that stone beside the mothers. She held their hands. She caught the babies. And she prepared the remedies that kept the mothers strong before and after. The stone and the plants were the same work. The stone was the place, the plants were the care. Dovy had died when Essie was 17. A quiet death at the cabin on Greer Branch, on a Saturday morning in October. She had been sitting at the oak table with a bundle of boneset she had been tying for drying, the cotton string still in her hand. Essie had been there. She had been walking up the hollow road for a Saturday visit when she had seen the cabin door open and the wood stove unlit and had known. Essie had taken Dovy's brass scales, the stone mortar and pestle, a set of small glass jars, and a framed photograph of Dovy at the oak table in 1990, mortar in hand, herb bundles hanging from the beams above her. After Dovy's death, Bertie had continued to keep Essie for 2 more years, but Bertie's health had declined. Arthritis, a bad hip, the accumulated wear of 73 years, and in the spring of Essie's 19th year, Bertie had gone into a nursing home in Marshall. The bank had taken the house. Essie had packed her rucksack. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and subscribe. It helps us keep making stories like this one. And tell us in the comments, have you ever held a plant to your nose and known by the smell exactly what it could do? She had $1 in her pocket and no car. She had Dovy's brass scales and the stone mortar and pestle in her rucksack. She was standing in the Marshall General Store the following week, buying a tin of coffee with the last of her change, when she overheard 2 women at the back of the store. One of them was talking about old buildings in the hollows. "Ada Worley's cottage up Greer branch is still standing," the woman said. "County put it on the surplus list years ago. Nobody wants it. $1. The other woman said, "That's the midwife's place. My mother was born on that stone." The first woman said, "Half the county was born on that stone." Essie turned around. "Where do I sign for it?" The first woman looked at her. She was in her 60s, in a flannel shirt and rubber boots. "County clerk's office right across the square." "You a Greer?" Essie said, "Yes, ma'am. Dovy's granddaughter." The woman looked at her for a long moment and said, "Then that cottage has been waiting for you." She walked to the Madison County Clerk's office that afternoon. The clerk, a woman named Mrs. Chandler, stamped the deed and handed Essie an iron key on a loop of cotton cord. "Ada Worley's key," Mrs. Chandler said. "Her niece brought it here after Ada died and said, 'Give it to whoever the hollow sends.' That was 1968. She looked at Essie. "Took the hollow 56 years, but here you are." She walked up the hollow road that evening. The cottage stood at the head of Greer Branch exactly as she had seen it every summer with Dovy, small, square stone, ivy-covered, with the chimney standing straight and the slate roof intact and the door locked. She put the key in the lock. It turned. 1 room, stone walls, a wide plank floor, heavy timber beams, a stone chimney with a wide hearth, and inside the front door, set into the floor, the birthing stone, a large flat piece of native stone about 3 feet by 4, worn smooth in 2 places where hands had gripped it. The stone was warm to the touch even in the evening. It held the day's heat the way only native stone can hold heat slowly and evenly, releasing it through the night. She knelt beside the birthing stone. She ran her fingers across the worn places and felt the smoothness left by 100 years of hands. Then she noticed that the stone sat slightly higher than the floor planks around it, maybe a 1/4 inch, and that the edges had been chiseled clean, the way a mason would prepare a stone that was meant to be lifted. She worked her fingers under the edge and lifted. The stone was heavy, but it came up evenly, balanced on its center of gravity the way a well-cut stone lifts. Beneath it, in a shallow cavity lined with flat creek stones wrapped in oilcloth, were a wooden box, a heavy canvas pouch, and a folded letter. The box held 24 small glass apothecary vials, each one sealed with a cork and wax, each one labeled in Ada Worley's handwriting with the plant name and the preparation type. Boneset, dried leaf, golden seal, dried root, wild cherry, bark tincture, slippery elm, inner bark powder, mullein, dried leaf, bee balm, dried flower. 24 preparations from 24 plants, each one a specific remedy Ada had used across 47 years. Beside the vials, a leather tool roll containing a set of brass apothecary scales with graduated weights, a stone mortar and pestle smaller and older than Dovy's, and a wooden herb press for extracting plant oils. The canvas pouch held gold coins, 31 Liberty Quarter eagles, dated between 1921 and 1967. The coin dealer in Asheville valued them at approximately $19,000. Beneath the box, wrapped separately in waxed cotton, was a thick, leather-bound book, a remedy book, page after page of hand-drawn botanical illustrations showing each plant Ada had used, with the gathering location, the gathering time, the preparation method, the dosage, and the condition it treated. 47 years of plant knowledge, recorded in careful ink with illustrations precise enough to identify each species by sight. The book was the pharmacopoeia of Greer branch. Tucked inside the front cover was a folded letter. To whoever lifts this stone. My name is Ada Worley. I have attended the families of this hollow from 1921 until today, the 3rd of October, 1968. I am 70 years old. I am leaving my tools and my remedy book and my savings beneath the birthing stone, because the stone is the center of this cottage, and what is placed beneath the center will keep. The vials hold preparations I have made across 47 years. Some of the plants are becoming hard to find. The book shows where they grow and how to prepare them. The gold is what I saved. Use it for the cottage. Gather the plants, prepare the remedies, care for whoever comes through the door. Ada Worley, Midwife, October 3rd, 1968. Essie read the letter twice. Then she opened one of the glass vials, the lavender, which Ada had labeled lavandula, dried flower, calming, and held it beneath her nose. The scent rose from the vial, faint and clear and unmistakable. 56 years old, but still present, still carrying in its dried petals the specific calm sweetness that lavender carries whether it was gathered in 1968 or yesterday. She did not cry, and she did not speak. She held the vial beneath her nose and breathed in and closed her eyes, and the smell was Dovy's kitchen and Ada's cottage and the woods behind the cabin, and every summer morning she had spent walking the hollow with a woman who knew the plants. She said quietly to the birthing stone and the stone walls and the beams above, "Thank you, Miss Worley. I will gather the plants." The next morning, she hitched a ride to Asheville and deposited the coin dealer's check at the bank on Patton Avenue. She opened a checking account and walked out into the October light. The following week, she bought a used truck, a 1998 Ford Ranger with 187,000 miles and a bed full of leaf litter, from a retired tobacco farmer in Mars Hill for $1,500. The first month was the chimney and the hearth. The flue was blocked with 56 years of bird nests and fallen mortar, and the hearth could not draw until the flue was clear. Essie borrowed a chimney brush from a man named Mr. Buckner, who ran the hardware store in Marshall and who had been born in the cottage. His mother had labored on the birthing stone in 1951. "My mama said Ada Worley had the calmest hands in Madison County," Mr. Buckner said, handing Essie the brush. "She said Ada never raised her voice and never hurried and never let go of your hand until the baby was breathing." He paused. "That stone in your floor, half the people in this county started their lives on that stone. She made the cottage livable in pieces. She bought a folding army cot from the thrift store in Mars Hill for $8 and set it against the east wall, near the small window that looked down the hollow road toward the creek. She found a small cast-iron wood stove at a yard sale in Barnardsville for $25, a parlor stove, squat and blackened, and Mr. Buckner drove up the hollow road in his truck with a length of stovepipe and helped Essie fit it through a hole she chiseled in the stone wall. Ada heated this room with a fire just like this, mister," Buckner said, tightening the pipe clamp. "A stone cottage holds heat better than any other kind of building. The stone absorbs it during the day and releases it at night. Ada used to say the cottage breathed warm." The first fire she lit, dry oak splits from a deadfall above the cottage, filled the room with a warmth that traveled through the stone walls and the wide plank floor and settled into the timber beams, and the stone walls absorbed the heat and held it, and the room was warm in the way only a stone room can be warm, evenly deeply, without drafts, the warmth coming from the walls themselves rather than from the air. The birthing stone in the floor caught the firelight and glowed, and Essie sat on the cot and looked at the stone and thought, this is what the laboring women felt. This warmth, this stone, these walls holding the heat. She hung the herb bundles first. Before the photograph, before the tools, before anything else, she hung herbs from the ceiling beams. Bundles of boneset and mullein and bee balm she had gathered from the woods above the cottage, tied with cotton string, labeled with paper tags in her own handwriting. The beams had iron hooks already in place, Ada's hooks, still solid after 56 years, and the bundles hung from them the way they had hung in Ada's time, the way they had hung in Dovy's kitchen, and the cottage smelled, for the first time in 56 years, like a working herb room. She set Dovy's photograph on the stone shelf above the cot. Dovy at the oak table in 1990, mortar in hand, beams above her, hung with the same kinds of bundles. She placed the 24 glass vials in a row on the windowsill, each one labeled, each one sealed, a spectrum of dried plant preparations from boneset to witch hazel. She set both mortars side by side on the hearthstone. Dovy's larger one and Ada's smaller, older one from the box, the two stones nesting together like hands clasped. A woman named Mrs. Plemons, who farmed the cove below the cottage, heard from Mrs. Chandler that a Greer girl had moved into Ada's place and walked up the hollow road on a Sunday afternoon with a cardboard box, a coffee pot, 2 enamel mugs, a skillet, a sack of cornmeal, a dozen eggs, a jar of sourwood honey, and a paper bag of dried ramps she had dug that spring. Dovy Greer made my mother a tea for her arthritis every October for 15 years, Mrs. Plemons said. My mother said the tea didn't cure the arthritis, but it made the arthritis bearable, and bearable was enough. She came back every Sunday after that. She always brought something from the garden. She got a job in her second year. A small botanical apothecary in Asheville, one of the new shops that were reviving traditional plant preparations for the wellness market, hired her 2 days a week. Because the owner, a woman named Dr. Leah Sutton, had heard from Mrs. Chandler that a young woman at the Worley cottage had a collection of 47-year-old plant preparations and a remedy book with hand-drawn botanical illustrations. Dr. Sutton had driven up the hollow road and had stood in the cottage looking at the vials on the windowsill and the remedy book on the shelf, and had said, "These preparations are museum quality. The book is a primary source ethnobotanical document. Where did you learn plant identification?" Essie said, "My grandmother." Dr. Sutton said, "Can you identify a plant by smell with your eyes closed?" Essie said, "Yes, ma'am, 24 species." Dr. Sutton hired her that afternoon. Word spread through the hollows. A woman in Walnut brought a jar of dried herbs she had found in her grandmother's attic and asked Essie to identify them. Essie opened the jar, smelled it, and said, "Boneset and horehound, mixed for a winter cough tea." The woman said, "That's exactly what my grandmother used it for." A man from Spring Creek brought a small leather pouch of dried root and said, "My father carried this in his pocket for 20 years. He said it was for his heart. What is it?" Essie held it to her nose. "Hawthorn berry, dried. It's a traditional heart tonic." The man had looked at the pouch in her hand and said, "He died with that pouch in his pocket." My mother said the only person who could have told us what it was died before he did. He paused. I guess she was wrong. On a clear evening in late September of her 22nd year, Essie sat on the stone step outside the cottage door and watched the last copper light fade across the hollow. Greer Branch ran clear over rocks below, the water catching the last light. The woods above the cottage were thick with the plants she had gathered all summer. The bergamot and the boneset and the mullein and the bee balm and the wild cherry and the golden seal, each one growing in the place Ada's remedy book said it would grow. Each one still there after 56 years, each one waiting. She thought about Ada, who had built this cottage with creek stone and had attended the families of the Hollow for 47 years, and who had sealed her tools beneath the birthing stone because the stone was the center, and what is placed beneath the center will keep. She thought about Dovy, who had walked up this hollow road every Saturday for 22 years to learn the plants, and who had continued the work from her own kitchen for 34 more years because the hollows still needed the care. And she thought about Elijah, who had known the basic remedies the way any mountain man knew them: boneset for fever, slippery elm for cough, and who had raised a daughter who learned the rest. That's the thing about the plants our grandmothers teach us to gather. We do not always know when we are 5 years old and kneeling in the woods beside an old woman who is crushing a bergamot leaf between her fingers that the kneeling is itself the trade. We learn it slowly, summer by summer, plant by plant, and then, 2 years after the old woman dies, we lift a birthing stone in a cottage she told us about and find 24 vials of dried preparations sealed for half a century, and we understand what she had been teaching us. She had been teaching us to find the smell in the woods. She had been teaching us that the plant and the tea are the same thing, and the trade is the gathering. Essie Greer was 19 years old and homeless. She had $1 to her name, and she spent it on a forgotten midwife's cottage on a hollow road in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. It was the best $1 she ever spent. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you loved it, we have something special for you. 12 brand new stories never released on YouTube, only available to the people who support this channel directly. Each one a full Quiet Road story, just like this one. There is also a full audiobook available for the people who want to listen to all 12 in one place. You will find the link in the bio. We poured our whole hearts into these, and we made them for the people who truly listen. Thank you for being one of them. See you on the next Quiet Road.